Welcome back, everyone. If you're listening to this, you're all about getting up to speed quickly on, well, the things that really matter.
Mm,
The stuff that's changing the world.
that's what we're here for.
We dig through all the noise and pull out the essential bits, right?
Exact.
But today, we're going deep, really deep, into something that's, well, it's got the potential to completely transform how we get clean energy from the oceans.
Yeah.
And that's floating offshore wind farms.
Yeah.
And, we all know the deal. We need more renewables.
Oh, yeah.
And this technology, it's tackling some of the biggest roadblocks we've got.
It's very exciting stuff.
So it's pretty fascinating.
Absolutely. So
Cool.
we've been diving into this really fascinating report by Cognitive Market Research.
Oh, okay.
And it really paints this amazing picture of how floating wind farms are really pushing the boundaries of renewable energy, especially, out there in deeper waters.
Okay.
That's what we're here to do today. Yeah. Unpack all of that and, try to get a handle on the huge potential and how it could really revolutionize offshore wind power.
Okay, let's get right into it. So far, offshore wind has been, it's been a growing player in the renewable energy game.
Yeah. Yeah.
But those standard, fixed bottom turbines that we've been seeing, they've got their own sort of built-in limitations, don't they?
Yeah, that's right. Traditional offshore wind farms, they depend on turbines that are, well, literally bolted to the seabed, right?
Right.
So that's fine. That works great in shallower waters near the coast. But it's a real barrier when we want to tap into those deeper, much richer areas of the ocean.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, think about those coastlines where the seabed just drops off really quickly,
Right.
Those prime wind locations further out, they're off limits for anything that's fixed to the bottom.
Yeah, yeah. It's almost like, knowing there's this treasure chest, just out of reach because you can't build a bridge long enough to get there.
That's a really good analogy.
And I also imagine trying to even install these things, these massive structures in really, really rough deep sea conditions.
Yeah.
That must come with a huge price tag, right?
Yeah, it does. The report really emphasizes that.
Yeah.
The costs for installing and maintaining fixed bottom wind farms, particularly in those kind of demanding, deep water environments, they're through the roof.
Right.
And
right.
that just naturally limits our ability to meet our growing energy needs in a sustainable way.
Okay. So this is where the idea of floating wind farms comes in.
Right.
It really sounds like a potential game changer.
It really does.
Yeah. So what's the basic concept here? How do they get around this deep water problem?
Well, the secret is it's all in the platform design. Instead of being fixed to the seabed, these turbines, they sit on top of these floating platforms.
Oh.
And these platforms can go into water depths, anywhere from around 60 meters to over a kilometer.
Wow.
And then they're anchored to the seafloor. They use these really sophisticated mooring systems.
Oh, yeah.
So it's kind of like, think of anchoring a huge ship in a storm.
Okay, yeah.
But it's with these really advanced multi-point connections. They're designed to allow the platform to move with the waves, but stay secure.
Right, right.
So, that way it's got the stability it needs to capture all that wind energy, even in those prime offshore locations where it's really rough.
So instead of building this permanent base right on the ocean floor,
Right.
you're essentially creating this stable floating island for the turbine.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, that opens up a whole new world of possibilities, doesn't it?
It really does.
Yeah. So what are some of the main advantages this approach brings to the table right away?
Oh, there's a bunch of really compelling benefits. First, and this is a big one, we've already touched on this, but they can reach much better wind resources, much further offshore.
Okay. Yeah.
And out there, the wind speeds, they're not just stronger, but they're also far more consistent.
Right.
Secondly, by moving these farms further out to sea, we can really reduce the impact on coastal communities.
Oh, yeah.
And existing marine industries, like fishing and shipping.
Right, right.
And this might surprise you, but in very deep water, installing and maintaining these floating platforms, it can actually be more cost-effective
Really?
than trying to build and maintain those fixed bottom turbines,
Okay, yeah.
because the conditions are so much more challenging down there.
Wow, that's a pretty amazing set of advantages, really transformative. And the report you mentioned, it really highlights how much momentum is building behind this tech, doesn't it?
Yeah, it really does. The market growth projections they're really remarkable. So the report says that the global floating wind power market, it was valued at 3.85 billion USD in 2024.
Okay.
And it's projected to reach a whopping 132.84 billion USD by 2034.
Wow.
So that's a compound annual growth rate, or CAGR, of 42.5%.
That's huge.
I mean, essentially that means, the market is predicted to more than double in size every couple of years.
Yeah, yeah.
So we're talking about really rapid expansion, and it shows just how much confidence there is in the future of this technology.
Those are really impressive numbers. Just to make sure we've got the basics down, what's the key difference we should remember between floating and fixed bottom wind farms?
The big difference is all about how they're anchored.
Okay.
Fixed bottom turbines, like we said, they're literally stuck to the seabed.
Right.
Floating wind farms, they use these advanced platforms that float to support the turbines. And that's particularly important when you're in water that's so deep. It's just not practical or economical to build those fixed structures.
Yeah.
And the floating platforms, they use those sophisticated mooring systems we talked about to stay stable.
Right. And the payoff, like we've been saying, is access to these huge, these previously unreachable parts of the ocean that are just packed with wind resources.
Yeah.
It's like unlocking this whole new energy frontier.
It really is. It's very exciting.
It was previously just completely off limits.
Absolutely. And the potential cost advantages, they're worth mentioning again.
Yeah.
Installing these floating platforms, especially when you're talking about projects far offshore in really deep water.
Right.
It can actually be easier and in the long run, less expensive.
Right.
Than the whole process of building and installing those fixed bottom structures in those same challenging conditions.
Yeah, yeah.
It's a big difference.
And we shouldn't forget about the potential for fewer conflicts, right? I mean, putting these wind farms further out to sea, it just seems like a smart way to avoid any issues with other activities out there. Like shipping, fishing, and also to minimize the visual impact for people who live along the coast.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, nobody wants their beautiful ocean view ruined by rows and rows of turbines.
Yeah, exactly.
If we can avoid it. And the report actually gives us an idea of just how big these installations are.
Well,
a typical, 6-megawatt floating barge wind turbine that can weigh anything between 2,000 and 8,000 tons.
Wow.
That's a serious piece of engineering.
That's massive.
It really is.
Now, I think the report mentioned a company that's really been leading the charge in actually making this technology a reality, right?
That's right. They highlighted BW Ideal.
Okay.
They're the only company so far that's actually installed, these megawatt scale barge-type floating offshore wind turbines.
Right.
And they've done it using their own damping pool barge floating substructure technology. It's pretty impressive.
Yeah.
And that real world experience, that's invaluable. Yeah. I mean, it's proof that this is more than just an idea.
Right.
It's actually happening.
It really solidifies that. Yeah. It's not just a drawing board thing.
Exactly.
It's out there.
It's real.
Now, the report keeps talking about the advantage of getting to those better wind resources in deeper waters.
Yeah.
Can you explain a bit more about why that's such a big deal?
Sure. Generally speaking, the further you go offshore, the higher and more consistent the wind speeds tend to be.
Okay.
And that means more energy production and better overall efficiency for the turbines.
Okay.
So by tapping into those more powerful, more reliable winds, we can really boost the potential of offshore wind as a dependable source of clean energy.
So it's not just about having more space to put the turbines, it's also about the quality of the wind resource.
Absolutely.
And that means a much better return on investment in terms of the energy you actually get out of it.
That's right.
Okay. Now, the report also goes into some detail about the research methodology they use to evaluate these floating wind farms.
Yeah.
And it sounds like a pretty rigorous approach.
Oh, it is. They did a full-on technical feasibility study,
Okay.
a thorough environmental assessment, and then they built these detailed economic models.
Wow. Okay. Let's break that down a bit. What does a technical feasibility study actually involve in this context?
Well, first of all, they do all these extensive and very sophisticated simulations of wind patterns and sea conditions,
Stuff.
specifically at those deep water locations that they're considering for these farms.
Right.
And those simulations, they're absolutely crucial for figuring out where to place the floating turbines
Okay.
to maximize their energy generation and make them as efficient as possible.
Right.
And they take into account all sorts of things, not just average wind speed,
Yeah.
but also extreme wind events, wave height, water depth, you name it. It's all about making sure that these turbines can actually withstand that often pretty harsh offshore environment
Yeah.
for the long haul.
That makes sense. You don't want to just throw these massive, complicated structures out there without really knowing what they're going to be up against.
No, absolutely not.
And then there's the cost-benefit analysis.
Yeah.
So what does that look like in this assessment?
So the cost-benefit analysis is all about figuring out if these projects actually make financial sense.
Okay.
And that means looking at all the costs involved, from the design and manufacturing to the installation, the ongoing maintenance, and then just the long-term operation.
Yeah.
But importantly, the study also projects what the potential return on investment could be.
Okay, right.
And this is a big one. It compares the estimated costs for these floating platforms with those of the traditional fixed bottom turbines.
Okay.
Especially when you're talking about putting them in similar deep water environments.
Right.
So you can really see if there are any economic advantages.
So it's not just about whether it can be done, it's also about whether it makes sense economically
Exactly.
in the long run.
Yeah.
And one thing that the report really emphasizes is the environmental impact assessment.
Yeah, that's crucial.
We want to make sure that we're not solving one environmental problem
Right.
and then creating another one in the process, right?
Exactly. So the environmental impact assessments are a big part of this.
Okay.
And those studies, they look at any potential risks to marine ecosystems
Right.
and the biodiversity in the area. And the report, it really stresses how important it is to work with marine biologists
Okay.
and environmental scientists
Yeah.
to make sure that when these floating wind farms are put in place and start running,
Right.
that it's all done in a way that minimizes any disturbance to the marine environment around them.
Okay. So it's all about finding a truly sustainable way forward.
That's right.
It sounds like a really comprehensive and responsible approach.
Yeah.
They're looking at all the angles here.
It seems like it.
Now, the report also mentions the bigger kind of the after effect of these floating wind farms.
Yeah.
What's the overall impact that they see?
Well, the report argues that floating wind farms, they're really a complete shift in the offshore wind industry.
Okay.
Because they open up all these massive areas of the ocean that were just off limits before because of the depth.
Right.
And by doing that, they dramatically increase the potential for large-scale renewable energy generation.
Wow.
So we're talking about tapping into these huge, almost untapped areas of the ocean
Yeah.
that are full of these consistent wind resources
Right.
that we just haven't been able to use until now.
So it's not just a little bump in capacity. It's a fundamental change in where we can actually get offshore wind power on a large scale
Exactly.
and do it in a way that makes economic sense.
That's the key.
And the report also points out that because of these better wind conditions, there's potential for being more cost-effective in generating energy.
Yeah, that's right. Because you can be much more strategic about where you put the turbines.
Okay.
You can put them in places where the wind conditions are ideal.
Mm.
And that means you lower the overall cost of producing electricity.
Okay.
The flexibility you get with floating wind farms, it just lets you be much more efficient,
Okay.
which helps to lower costs and really maximize how much clean energy you can produce.
And I imagine as the technology continues to improve,
Oh, yeah.
we're going to see even better turbine designs, better mooring systems. The platforms themselves will be more stable.
Absolutely.
And all of that adds up to better performance.
Right.
And lower costs in the long run.
Exactly.
Now, to really give us a sense of how much the whole offshore wind energy sector is growing, the report shares some pretty impressive statistics, doesn't it?
It does.
Yeah.
According to the International Renewable Energy Agency, the global installed offshore wind energy capacity grew by a huge amount,
Okay.
17.26% just in the fiscal year 2023-24.
Wow.
And over 10,000 megawatts of new capacity were added just in 2023.
That's a lot.
It is.
That's a serious amount of growth.
It really is. And it just shows how strong the upward trend is in the industry.
Right.
And floating wind farms, they're going to play a bigger and bigger role in that expansion.
Yeah. And going back to the environmental side of things, it's good to know that they're paying close attention to minimizing any impact on marine life.
Oh, absolutely. The report really emphasizes the importance of careful and ongoing monitoring
Wow.
and scientific studies
Yeah.
to make absolutely sure that once these floating wind farms are up and running,
Right.
that they have as little negative impact as possible on those delicate marine ecosystems.
Yeah.
Sustainability is at the heart of everything they do, from the planning stages all the way through to when they're eventually taken down.
Right. Now, the report also takes a look at how a company, one that's in the renewable energy business,
Yeah.
how they would actually benefit from using this floating wind farm technology.
Right.
So what are the main advantages for them in this competitive energy market?
Well, for a company that's, really looking ahead, the advantages are huge.
Okay.
First of all, they get access to those deeper, more consistently windy areas of the ocean.
Right, right.
And that means they can expand their operations into these energy-rich regions that just weren't accessible before with the traditional fixed-bottom technology.
Okay.
And that can really boost their energy generation capacity
Yeah.
and help them grab a larger share of the global renewable energy market, which is growing all the time.
Yeah, yeah.
And it really positions them as leaders in this new area of offshore wind technology.
So it's not just about, small increases in growth.
Yeah.
It's about opening up these whole new opportunities for serious expansion
Exactly.
and really getting a much stronger, more competitive position in the market.
That's right. And the report also talks about the competitive edge you get when you can, put turbines in deep water,
Okay.
where the conventional ones just won't work.
Right.
So that greater potential for generating energy and the possibility of lower costs for installation and operation,
Okay.
that can mean better profit margins.
Right.
But beyond the money, it also means that these companies can make a bigger contribution to hitting those global renewable energy targets.
Yeah, yeah.
And fighting climate change.
And I imagine there's also a pretty big reputational benefit for companies that get on board with this kind of cutting-edge technology early on.
Oh, absolutely. By embracing floating wind farm technology,
Yeah.
a company can really boost its reputation as an innovator
Right.
in the renewable energy sector. And that kind of forward-thinking image, it's attractive to new business partners.
Yeah.
And it can even open doors to government incentives.
Okay.
And supportive regulations
Yeah.
that are designed to encourage more growth in sustainable energy.
So they're kind of getting rewarded for being ahead of the curve.
Exactly.
And I think the report even gave a specific example of a big investment in this area, didn't it?
Yeah, they talked about Octopus Energy.
Okay.
Which is a major European player in renewable energy.
Yeah.
And they made a significant investment in a U.S. company called Ostergy
Okay.
back in April 2024.
Right.
And Ostergy, they're focused on developing and deploying floating offshore wind technology. So that investment, it really shows how much confidence is growing in this field.
Yeah, yeah.
And how much potential people see in floating offshore wind farms.
So it's clear that these floating offshore wind farms they're not some futuristic fantasy. They're happening now.
They're real.
And they're moving fast.
Absolutely. They really represent a huge step forward
Yeah.
in our efforts to harness the power of offshore wind energy.
Right.
As a reliable and sustainable source of clean energy for the future.
So as we wrap up our deep dive today, what's the one big takeaway you'd want our listeners to remember about floating wind farms?
I think the key message is that floating wind farms are a really big deal.
Yeah.
They're a potential game changer in the renewable energy field. They overcome the limitations of traditional offshore wind technology, the kind that has to be fixed to the seabed.
Right.
And they do that by opening up these vast new areas of the ocean that are full of these strong, consistent winds.
Yeah.
And that was something that we just couldn't do before.
Right. And it's not just about accessing more wind, is it?
No, it's not. We're talking about the possibility of saving money in the long run, especially in those deep water environments. and reducing the impact on the environment and on communities
Yeah.
compared to some of the old ways of getting energy.
Right.
And we're also seeing this huge growth in the market.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's really a combination of technological progress, environmental responsibility, and economic opportunity.
Mm.
It makes floating offshore wind a really exciting area to watch.
This has been a really fascinating deep dive into a really cutting-edge area of renewable energy.
It has been.
Thanks for sharing your expertise
You're very welcome.
and for shedding light on this really important topic.
Oh, it's always great to talk about this kind of, human ingenuity
Yeah.
that's driving the shift to cleaner and more sustainable energy sources.
And for all of you listening out there, as you think about what we've talked about today, think about what this technology could mean for global energy independence
Hmm.
and the potential for our oceans to become these massive clean energy powerhouses.
Mm.
What new innovations are we going to see as this field keeps growing and developing?
That's a great question.
It's a pretty exciting prospect to think about.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Thanks, everyone.
We'll see you next time.
See you then.